Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 453 through 456, which is 4 episodes. And the reason for that is because we will be covering the events of the 11th cover story. So I wanted to cover it in its entirety, which is the Straw Hat Seperation serial, where in the manga, it spanned chapters 543 through 560. Over 16 installments. And yeah, we finally get another cover story adapted into the anime finally. And it's about time. And you can see why this one couldn't be skipped over, because it is pretty vital to the growth of the Straw Hats as we see them through this and then in later episodes as well. So the synopsis, here we see the events of what happened to the other 8 members of the Straw Hat crew and what they've been up to during this time while Luffy was in Impelled Down after they were all separated at the hand of Kuma in Sabaody. Alright, so differences. Obviously, there are going to be a lot of differences in liberties taken since they are adapting still images into fully fledged episodes with dialogue and everything. So I won't point out every difference there are, but a few that I want to mention is the order of the stories that are being told. So in the manga, the chapter covers, they go in this order. So they tell Sanji, Robin, Frankie, Usopp, Nami, Brook, and then finally Zoro. But in the anime, it's told in a almost completely different order, where we start with Nami, Frankie, Sanji, Chopper, Robin, Usopp, Zoro, and then finally Brook. And I don't know what the rationale was, or maybe it flowed better, or could just also be like scheduling for the voice actors. Who knows why the order was changed. The remaining changes and differences, it'll probably just be easier for me to actually talk about them as we go through the episodes, so I will save those for later. So yeah, let's just jump right into the episodes. First off, I think it's very interesting that Oda decided to put such important character growth moments of his main characters and relegated them to side stories in the chapter covers. I know why he did that, so that he could keep the pace of the story going and not interrupt the flow of the story, because yes, when you do look at the totality of the next arc and the remainder of the saga, there really isn't a good place to actually slot these stories in without it feeling forced, or there would be too much downtime at such a pivotal moment in the story, because Impelled Down and Marineford are some of the most intense arcs in the entire story, and so when you try and wedge these in there, it really cuts down sort of the dramatic tension. I mean, it's clearly evident in the anime when you see how it just completely interrupts the superb build-up to the Paramount War at Marineford, to then have it be stopped dead in its tracks by not only these 4 episodes, but another 2 random recap ones as well, before we actually get to Marineford. Anyway, so the first story and character we follow is Nami on the Sky Island of Witheria. And this is the island that studies the weather and builds technology based around it, which seems like the perfect place for Nami to end up in, except she obviously wants nothing more than to get back to Sabaody. And I will say, the old man whose name we learn much later on is Herodis, but I don't really think it's much of a spoiler to know his name right now, so I'll just mention it here. And this guy does have a certain charm about him that I do enjoy, but damn, his trademark oi 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 saying is really grating, and I hate it every time he does it. It's so annoying. But everything else, he seems like a really cool and nice man. And so the story follows them down to a nearby island that is struggling from a major drought, and Herodis is down there to help the people for a price, which interestingly enough sounds a lot like Nami. He even starts off with the ridiculous price of 100 million berries, to which everyone rightly mentions that they can't pay that, and then he reconsiders and lowers it to a measly 100 berries, which is a huge discount. And this gag actually got a pretty good laugh out of me because of the stark differences in price. And obviously, after seeing the power of the Witheria society, Nami reconsiders wanting to leave so hastily, as she realizes she can learn quite a few things from this guy and the researchers there. And this scenario, of course, has many similarities to Arabasta and their drought problems, which were artificially caused by Crocodile, as well as the idea of producing rain to alleviate the drought. However, unlike dance powder, which steals naturally occurring rain from another place that would supposedly get it, this weather machine that Herodotus has actually developed produces rain, which makes this less problematic than dance powder and probably not illegal. And I just thought that it was interesting how different technology can solve problems for other people, but because of how separate the world of One Piece is, this technology isn't readily available to those of it in need, because clearly this machine would have been very useful for the citizens of Arabasta during that whole thing, and obviously it wouldn't have resulted in that civil war or anything. Although even with the machine, I would imagine that Crocodile still could just soak up the moisture and maybe stop the rain anyways, but yeah. Now, the manga chapter only depicts 2 moments from this story, and that is Herodotus negotiating the price for making it rain. But interestingly enough, this exact scene is never actually in the anime. So in chapter 555, we see him holding up a scroll parchment and pointing to it, presumably explaining his machine, with the mayor of the town looking very happy. But in the anime, while Herodotus does have the parchment, he never actually opens it up, and this moment is never actually recreated. And in the next entry, we see the moment where the rain starts coming down. That's pretty much all we get for this cover story, though, is those 2 specific moments. So everything outside of Nami looking up at the rain and then Herodotus pointing to the scroll, all of that stuff is filler. Or I guess I don't know if it's filler, because I would imagine that Oda had some input on what they could actually do with these and what they could actually fill this stuff in with. But anyways, let's move on to the next story and character, and that's with Frankie on Karakuri Island. As I've mentioned in the past, Karakuri basically means simple mechanics. And we still see him in his hilarious polite gentleman form after he was refueled with Darjeeling tea instead of cola. And the little boy, whose name is Kitten, wants to try and revert Frankie back to his old ways, and so he throws Frankie in the forest with a bunch of dangerous cyborg mech animals. And I love how in the anime, the narrator has to go out of his way to tell kids not to try this at home. As if like people would just throw like their like uncles out in the forest to see if it would make them cooler. But aside from the obvious filler additions to elongate the sequence, the anime version still sees Frankie in his gentleman form, as opposed to the chapter covers in the manga, which actually has Frankie already reverted back to his normal status. It does create a hilarious scene where Mr. Frank is trying to calmly reason with the cyborg gorilla, and he constantly gets interrupted by being punched in the face. And once he turns back, they use the whole hentai tai hen inversion wordplay when Frankie recovers, but then he eventually just runs out of steam. That whole scene where he's trying to reason with the cyborg gorilla and he just keeps getting punched. Oh man, I was dying the first time I watched that. We then get some story points that play somewhat significantly to the overall story, and they discover an old abandoned laboratory of the famous Dr. Vegapunk, who we know is a pivotal character in the scientific community of One Piece. We unfortunately don't learn much about him other than he was working on cybernetic enhancements on animals, no doubt which was a precursor to his enhancements on Kuma and the creation of the pacifistas that kind of decimated the Strong Hats just a few episodes ago. Now, Vegapunk has always loomed as a very hidden but large presence in the background of the story due to his connections with the world government and his work on not only weapons for them, but also his research on the devil fruits. So it always perks your ears up whenever you hear his name or learn anything about him as the story progresses. And obviously, this, like Nami, is setting Frankie up for a potential knowledge and technology growth by reverse engineering some of Vegapunk's leftover tech and research to further augment himself for a massive power-up when he regroups with the crew. All right, moving on to our third story, we see what's up with Sanji on his island, Momoiro Island or Peachy Island. So this is what I've been kind of dancing around this entire time when talking about how Oda handles the LGBTQ characters and subjects. And I think on the whole, he's done a pretty decent job with representation, aside from a bit of stereotyping in terms of mannerisms and the way they dress. However, this whole side story with Sanji is just bizarre because There is potential for some real character growth with this weird story of Sanji potentially becoming a queer character, because Oda could have taken this in a couple different directions. And I am going to spoil this for you because nothing of the sort that I'm talking about happens. And while I won't tell you what actually does happen, I will mention what doesn't happen. And I think first is that Sanji as a character has always been a very unique character in that he has always had both very masculine and feminine qualities. He's very masculine in the sense that he's incredibly powerful, competitive, has a high sex drive, but at the same time, he has very traditionally feminine qualities as well, like being very emotional, caring, kind, and cooks for the crew. Now, I know both genders can be all these things, but just from a historical, stereotypical standpoint, this is how it's usually viewed. So it could make sense for Oda to take it in a number of directions where one, maybe where Sanji realizes that he potentially is gay, or even go further and realize that he identifies as a transgender female, maybe. On the other hand, Oda could have also used this opportunity to grow Sanji's character in another way, and that is his views and relationships towards women in general. And we all know how Sanji puts women on a pedestal by romanticizing and idolizing them to his detriment. And we've already seen how he was almost killed by Khalifa at Enies Lobby because he wouldn't harm a woman. And again, while it is an admirable trait not to harm women, I think it's an issue when said woman is actively trying to murder you. And, by being made to dress up and treated like a woman while on this island, he could have been shown what it's actually like to be a woman, and maybe had his perspective changed about his behavior towards women, as well as his idolization being somewhat toxic, in addition to his overall perviness towards them as well. I'm not saying those aspects of him should have been completely removed, but perhaps some growth and maturity in that regard could have been an interesting avenue to explore. However, neither of these things happen. In addition to that, the inhabitants of Momoiro Island are portrayed in a very unflatteringly and frankly very negatively stereotypical ways. But like I've said, I think for Oda, this wasn't done out of malice, and it was more so just out of the sort of the conservative culture when it comes to the LGBTQ subject matter in Japan. And I am glad to see in future depictions and characters, Oda does seem to learn and grow as an author, because he introduces much better LGBTQ representation characters. And yeah, we'll get to those characters when they do appear. But yeah, I do always, I don't know, I never really liked this whole storyline very much. As for the differences with Sanji's story, we just get a bunch more filled in, as the covers only show Sanji running for his life in the mansion, and then we jump to the scene where he's dressed as a woman running on the beach with the other girls. And that's literally only 2 scenes that are actually covered in the chapter covers. Moving to our next character, we catch up with Chopper on his mysterious jungle island ruled over by giant birds who are at war with the human inhabitants. And in the time between the last time we saw Chopper, somehow he managed to escape being eaten by the natives and is now taking care of a giant chick. This entire sequence and whole storyline is pretty much added filler in the anime, as the chapter covers only show Chopper basically escaping the natives and then trying to avoid getting caught up in the war between the natives and the giant birds. Interestingly enough, these are both covered in the episode, but they're literally over in seconds through Chopper's sort of recollection flashbacks. And the actual storyline that's in this episode is wholly original to the anime. And it's not a very interesting story, but clearly we see that Chopper is here to learn more about medicine through the vegetation that's found on this unique and isolated island as he cares for this giant chick. The 5th Straw Hat member we get back to is Robin, and her time at the Tequila Wolf construction site, where she's being held prisoner as a slave. And this is a really hard one to see, especially knowing Robin's past. She spent her entire life running, trying to avoid this type of life, but she somehow ended up back in a place like this. And Robin is truly an incredibly strong person, like mentally strong and also physically. And sure, the other Straw Hats are strong and have their own iron wills, but I think Robin, who's easily lived the second hardest life out of everyone, may be only slightly rivaled by Nami. But probably easily beaten by Brook, but Brook has clearly lost his mind a little bit, so maybe he's not quite as mentally strong, even though his situation was pretty extreme. But yeah, you can see how resilient she is to the harsh environment and torture she endures, and just kind of wisecracks her way through the whole thing, despite just how much of a toll it's taking on her. Robin's story is probably the most compelling and well done of the 8 stories. I love all the characters, including Sora, the little girl with the heart of gold, and her subplot with the lady that betrayed them in the earlier episodes and turned Robin in. She highlights that most of these people aren't bad or evil, they're just desperate and in an impossibly difficult situation. And the fact that Sora at a young age recognizes and forgives that lady is honestly one of the highlights of these episodes. And the fact that it's original to the anime is even more amazing. In fact, this entire story is altered quite heavily from the 2 chapter covers. So in the manga chapter covers, we see Robin break out and run from the guards, and then in the next installment, she meets up with the Revolutionary Army. Now, while those basic events are still present in the anime, they get there in very different ways. First off, the addition of Sora and her story is clear, the difference, as well as the Revolutionary Army officer being the target of the rescue in addition to Robin, because it's depicted in a way that Robin was never the actual goal. It was always this old officer. And in the manga, you get the impression Robin broke herself out, whereas in the anime, she's helped out by the Revolutionary Army and this officer. And yeah, thankfully, it's not too long before the good fortune comes Robin's way and we start to see why Kuma sent her here, and that is the Revolutionary Army comes to attack and break one of their own out in the process, allowing Robin to escape as well. This then begs the question though, how did Kuma know the Revolutionary Army would be there? And for that matter, it's still a mystery how Kuma knows at all where any of them should have been sent. Of course, with my knowledge, having read all the way through, I have a pretty good idea about how he knew where to send certain people, but we're never actually explicitly told. We kind of just have to infer based on the information we get drip-fed throughout the rest of the entire series up until this very day with chapter 1098. And so, yeah, I will kind of go into this in the spoiler section a little bit. It's really a shame, though, we don't get to see more of this story yet, because it's a really great one that I want to see much more of. Going from the somber tone of Robin's story, we zip right over to the more chaotic and comedic Usopp story, where he is seen being chased by a gigantic man-eating sunflower. Unlike Robin's story, Usopp's story is probably one of the weaker ones, in that not much really happens. I did love the joke where Heracles is explaining to Usopp that currently he's the weakest thing on the island, below even the ants and worms, and Usopp's response, "What are you talking about? I'm at least stronger than ants and worms," before being cut off because there is a building-sized ant and worm right behind them. And before Heracles takes them out and asks if they want to eat them. This whole sequence is pretty funny. And it's at this point the story takes a turn for the insanity and weird and bizarre, as Heracles shows Usopp this forest of plants that look like real-world food for some reason, and it seems to be irresistible to consumption, and Usopp ultimately ends up becoming crazy fat. And this doesn't even seem like a gag fat, like when Luffy eats too much, like he'll get super fat, and even Usopp's been seen this way, but literally the next scene, they'll go back to their normal bodies. This seems like an actual like change in his body, and the way Heracles treats this, it seems like this is more permanent than just a visual gag. And we come to see why, as this entire island is a huge carnivorous plant akin to like a Venus flytrap that fattens its inhabitants and then eats them later. It's very weird. Now, the events of this largely play out similarly in the manga chapter covers. However, the cover installments, there seems to be no mention of the man-eating island, at least just yet. This will later get canonized in the manga as of chapter 591. However, it's depicted there without teeth, so I think because they didn't know what the man-eating island was going to look like, they gave it teeth, but then when Oda actually wrote the island and the island Venus flytrap monster thing, he didn't give it teeth, so they had to go back and they fixed it later, but But yeah, this first appearance of the man-eating island does have teeth. Lastly, with our final episode, we get Zoro and Brook. And starting off with Zoro, he is just running around trying to figure out where he is and get back to his swords. But his directional troubles are so pronounced that he has been running around the castle for 2 days. Even the Perona was at first trying to mess with Zoro. She starts to feel sorry for him and just starts telling him where to go, and even starts to cheer him on because of how pathetic he seems. Similar to how she rooted for Usopp when she learns of his deep negativity on Thriller Bark. And quite honestly, I love this one, if not for the sheer fact that Perona and Zoro's comedic chemistry is amazing, with his lack of directional awareness and Perona's exasperated expressions. And this cover story is, for the most part, original to the anime. Really, the only part that actually shows up in the chapter cover is the very end where they find the giant wooden grave, and then the part where they're being tracked by some shadowy figures. However, in the anime, we actually get to see them attack as well. And so instead of just seeing one figure pick up the sword in the foreground, we actually see that there's a bunch of them in the anime. The other thing that the anime kind of spoils too is that in the manga chapter, or at least the manga chapter covers, we don't really get a sense of who this person is. But in the anime, they make it clear that they don't fully show them, but the silhouettes make it very apparent that these are some sort of primate beasts, like either monkeys or gorillas or something like that. Unfortunately, this is where his story ends, and we don't really get much expansion on where he's actually is right now. But perhaps Zoro was sent here to fight off these sword-wielding beasts to get stronger. And finally, last but not least, we get the Brook's story on the island of Harahetanya or Hungaria. Haraheta is literally hungry, or I'm hungry in Japanese, and it's more so the very informal way of saying it, as opposed to the more proper way of saying it, onakasuita. While the whole panties gag has grown very tiresome for me, I do like that this story has turned it on its head and has made Brook regret asking unsuspecting ladies to show him their panties. But it's still a running gag that I'm not a fan of. I do like that it basically all the men are the one basically lifting up their robes to show Brook their underwear so that this sort of Satan figure would help them. However, Brook's story is probably one of the more compelling ones, as there is an actual conflict he has to contend with, in that the Long Arm tribe are coming in and pillaging this village's people and resources. And these people, having no choice as their prayers weren't met from their god, they resorted to calling upon the devil. But instead, they were met with Brook, who I can completely understand why they'd mistake him for Satan. And this is sort of another instance of the fact that we have some form of Christianity existing in the world of One Piece, the first being Kuma's Bible. And we also get the name of the Long Arm people, which is a unique species of what I'm presuming are humans, but they have especially long arms and a whole other set of joints and forearms, giving them basically 2 sets of elbows. Interestingly, these people aren't the first time we've ever seen a member of these species, and we were actually introduced to one of these people in the form of the recently revealed member of the Worst Generation in Scratchman Apu. The music-wielding pirate who we saw on Sabodi is actually one of these tribes as well, as you probably noticed. I think one thing that stood out to me about this cover story is that it again brings up the theme of the over-reliance of divine intervention from the people of One Piece. And we've seen this in many moments of people sitting back and doing nothing, just praying when they could have at least tried to do something to help themselves. And Brook rightly points out here when the lady gets abducted and they all just kind of stand around doing nothing. And Brook then, in order to repay the people's kindness, decides to embrace the role of Satan and offers to help them as he sits down and begins to write music. Where that is going, I have no idea, or at least I didn't at the time. And I don't know how this is supposed to help, but for Brook, I'm sure his music does have some weird properties and can do things. But yeah, I mean, just like we saw in Skypiea, particularly, where we saw this theme in One Piece of people praying for help, but not really doing anything about it and hoping other people will do something. And it'll be interesting to see how, again, this theme is explored when this story actually does get resolved. But like Zoro's story, the majority of this follows the same narrative, but they bolster it with much more setup, as only the few final moments of the lady being abducted and Brooke sitting down to write the music are the two moments that are actually depicted in the chapter covers. So everything that leads up prior to that is filler or original to the anime. One last thing I wanted to mention is the present day filler scene added between Crocodile and Jinbei at the end of episode 456, where Crocodile gets into an argument and almost comes to blows with Jinbei. And this scene is so stupid. Crocodile is for the most part a very smart guy. So the idea that he would openly threaten and initiate a fight with Jinbei in open waters is so dumb. Crocodile is useless when exposed to water. So for him to attack a fishman, and not just any fishman, but one of the most powerful ones in the world, in a ship surrounded by miles of water, is just asinine stupid. And all Jinbei has to do is jump in the water, use his fishman jujitsu, and splash a tidal wave of water on the boat, giving Crocodile nowhere to run. It's so dumb. I don't know what they were thinking when they were adding this. I know Crocodile is very prideful and combative, but this just seems really out of character to me. And also just hilariously stupid on his part. But anyways, that's just that's just something I wanted to mention. But yeah, in closing, of course, their stories aren't finished yet, and as they're all basically left off on cliffhangers of some sort, and we will get to see more of them later on. But overall, I found these stories a bit underwhelming because they serve more as setup for each of their respective stories rather than an actual story or anything actually happening in them. But I am glad that we finally got another cover story animated into the anime. But unfortunately, this is pretty much the last one, at least as of episode 1084 is where we're at right now, I think. But anyways, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter account at SunnyGoPodcast for updates of when I post new episodes. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast and supporting me out there. And yeah, I'll have a brief spoiler section talking kind of about Kuma and his role in all of this. But if you're not interested in any of that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! Okay, so spoiler section. So while I don't think I'll be talking about anything in the most recent chapters, I will say, just in case, yeah, this will basically be talking about everything up until chapter 1089, or 1098, sorry. But yeah, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about why or how Kuma knew where to send everyone. And I guess I'll just go in order. And give my thoughts and theories on why or how Kuma knew to send them to specific locations. So starting with Luffy, I think he sent him to Amazon Lily mostly because the Kuja pirates and the tribe of the Amazon Lily people, they seem to have a much more solid understanding of haki, and particularly you see even just the regular warriors using armament haki. And so I think Kuma knew to send him there because that would basically get Luffy kickstarted in sort of being able to have him learn haki. And most likely he knew to send them here because it seems like he had some passing familiarity with Rayleigh. And of course, we later learned that Rayleigh has a very close relationship with Amazon Lily, particularly with Shaki, who used to be the leader of the tribe, which is now being held down by Hancock. All right, so Zoro is pretty obvious. We know why Kuma sent him here because he knew Mihawk lived on this island, and he also sent Perona here. And clearly, the best person for Zoro to learn from to get stronger is Mihawk. So this is a pretty clear-cut reason. Nami is also pretty clear-cut as well. Although, what I don't understand is how Kuma knew about Nami's sort of fighting proficiency with weather-based attacks. That I don't quite know. Like, did he just observe that or get like a report for something like about their actions in both Arabasta and on Enies Lobby? But in both cases, no one witnessed either fight, so I don't understand how he would have that knowledge. But it seems like he knew that Nami used weather-based attacks in center there. That part is still kind of a mystery to me. Usopp, on the other hand, I really have no idea. I don't know why he sent Usopp to this island, to be frank. I still haven't figured out a connection or what he could have been thinking about. Sanji, he sent him to Momoiro Island, I think because he felt like he could probably learn from Ivankov, because we obviously later learned that Kuma is part of the Revolutionary Army and was very good friends with Ivankov growing up. And so he probably felt that Sanji could learn from Ivankov's sort of unorthodox physical fighting style. And yeah, and obviously he learns a lot of other things like different recipes and different cooking styles, as well as learning how to do Geppo because he had to keep running from the inhabitants of Momoiro Island. But I think it was primarily due to him hoping that Ivankov would kind of mentor Sanji. Chopper is another one that I didn't quite understand. The only thing I can think of is that he basically deduced that Chopper was their doctor, and he sent him to an island that had a lot of like strange and unique plant life that would, serve as good medicine. That's the only thing I can think of. Robin is very obvious. He meant Robin to basically end up with the Revolutionary Army, being someone that can read the poneglyphs and is actively being hunted down by the world government. He clearly wanted the Revolutionary Army to intercept Robin, and so he put her in a place where that could happen. And I'm assuming that Kuma still at this point had a lot of communication with Dragon and knew that they were basically going to try and break this officer out, and so he probably sent her there. Frankie is another one that's pretty obvious as well. I think because we later find out that both Kuma and Vegapunk are good friends, and in fact Vegapunk is the one that cybernetically enhances him and does all that shit to him. And so, yeah, this seems like a no-brainer with Cyborg Frankie being his epithet. Like, it seems like he would gain a lot of knowledge by being sent to one of Vegapunk's old labs. And then finally, Brook. This one, I don't know. I really don't know. Was Kuma aware that these people needed help or something like that? Because we know Kuma, like, more recently in his flashback, we see he's kind of like a saint who basically tries to help as many people as possible, and so maybe he had heard the plight of these people and wanted to send Brook somewhere that he could help. Other than that, I don't really know why else he would send Brook here, or why he even knew that these people needed help. So yeah, that one's still a bit of a mystery to me. So yeah, I think Usopp and Brook are probably the two that I know the most little about in terms of like what connection and how Kuma knew to send them there. And to be honest, I don't know that we ever will here. I mean, we're still going through Kuma's flashback, so maybe we'll get more context about how how Kuma knew all of this. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see what we'll learn once Kuma's entire flashback is done, and probably what we're going to see is Kuma's death eventually. I think in the next like couple chapters, starting from 1098, 1099, maybe 1100, like we will be seeing the end of Kuma, which is really sad. Like, is not to like lay anything, and talk about anything too prematurely, but his backstory is one of the most tragic ones in the entire series. It's brutal. But yeah, we'll see how that ends and whether it will. I mean, right now, Law's flashback for me is probably one of the most brutal and dark. Maybe Doflamingo's as well. But Kuma is about to outpace both of them, depending on how it ends. But anyways, thanks for listening. And yeah, we will get back to the main story events after this on the next podcast. So thanks for listening and see ya.